you have in the group, and this is just what happens in groups of all kinds, you have somebody who takes that initiation and takes on that more of a leadership role, even though within the organization they may not be the leader. They may be the person who's posing a lot of those curious questions, as we were talking about earlier. So that becomes modeled within the group.
You're listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author Sarah Box. We focus on the mantra, no labels, no limits, no excuses. And now, without further ado, please welcome your commanding coach with plenty of chutzpah and heart, Sarah Box.
Hello, No Labels, No Limits podcast listeners. I'm Sarah Box, your host, and I want to welcome you back to the No Labels, No Limits podcast. And you know we are here to inspire you and me and anybody listening to break free from limiting beliefs and to think outside the box. Whether you're flying solo as an entrepreneur, you're part of a team, or you're driving change through a nonprofit. So in each episode, we really strive to bring you extraordinary guests who have shattered stereotypes, achieved incredible personal and professional milestones, and been able to come back and offer some of the lessons that they've learned and for the rest of us so that we can, as my dad used to say, learn from others' experiences so we don't have to keep bumping our knees on the same rocks. So anyway, today I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Elyse Dub, who is a licensed psychologist and the visionary founder of Insight Onsite. And with over 2 decades of experience in mental health, Dr. Dub is dedicated to transforming workplace environments. Now, with that, one of the things that she does is she focuses on the power of psychological insights, fostering cultures of deep connection, inclusion, and belonging. And, you know, her work not only helps and enhances productivity and retention, but it also really enriches those relationships we have at work, both with our coworkers and with the organization itself. And you might be surprised to learn that despite not having a traditional business background, Dr. Dub, or Elyse, is passionately involved in creating those kinds of networks that build and sustain successful organizations and operations. So with that, let's formally welcome Dr. Elyse Dub to the podcast. Hi, Elyse.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and I love that detailed introduction and to dig into a lot of good conversation with you today.
I'm open. So, because there's many things I could tap you for, and it may be hard for me to stay focused. So if I do, I know you've got the training and professional skills to go, okay, now we were talking, bring it on back. No, I'm just teasing. I am very focused on you today. You talk about how curiosity plays a crucial role in how you approach relationships, both personal and professional. And you and I, before we hit record, were just touching on that. Can you share how this sense of curiosity has shaped your career or approach?
Absolutely. I'll give you maybe some of the background and how I found my company Insight Onsite, because it really is, the founding of the company is based in an inherent curiosity. I had been in private practice as a psychologist for many, many years. And just prior to the pandemic starting, believe it or not, I really noticed an uptick in phone calls to me. People were asking questions about something related to mental health, whether it was in my wheelbox of professional experience or not. If someone knew I was a psychologist, they would just ask questions. And they were looking to me for the answers to them. And some of the time I could lead people down a path of, who maybe you should talk to, or what kinds of questions you could ask of some type of a helping professional, be it a psychologist, speech therapist, occupational therapist, physical therapist, whomever it is. And when I founded my business, I thought to myself, I'm a psychologist. I have all this experience. I'm going to give some workshops on things that I know about, and I'm going to just share all this stuff. And that was all well and good. Again, I was responding to what I was seeing outside of my professional private practice work, all of these phone calls. And then as I started giving more and more talks in organizations about things like listening, about parenting, about working parenting, about kids, running the gamut of things that I was doing professionally, what I started to notice is that people were talking amongst themselves. And it was about the topics we were talking about. I'm like, oh, wow, that's so interesting. I don't know what to do with that. We had interactive activities, but it was always me with some big PowerPoint. And then as I started doing more and more work, it was that curiosity that kept gnawing at me, that I would go back to clients. I would ask them, well, how did that go? And I would ask for feedback, and I would ask for things that were helping me to form what an iteration of the business was. And then from there, I was like, oh, it's not about me and what I'm bringing. It's what we can all share with one another. We all have innate curiosities about the world around us. We all have unique life and lived experiences. And when I flipped the business on its head and made it more about everybody else, it came to a place that for me felt more comfortable, as that's what I love. And that's what I see in other people. They want to learn from one another. They need to be given an opportunity, especially within our workplaces.
So how did that look practically? Because you said it flipped the business on the head. So you were going in, and if I'm catching you correctly, you were going in and saying, this is what I offer. Here's my workshop, if that's the case, right? And then delivering.
Yes.
And then when you flipped it, though, were you co-creating those workshops prior to showing? What were you doing different so our listeners can get a grip on that?
Right. No, thank you for that clarification. I think a couple of things were happening. There was absolutely more co-creation, because we do things better when we work together and we work collaboratively. There was definitely that piece of co-creation within organizations. There was that. There was a greater sense of getting a needs assessment to figure out what the needs are. So that was happening simultaneously. And then what I started to do is to really just not go in with all of this prepared stuff that I'm going to tell you about. For the most part, right? Some of it does look like that, but it became much more interactive. For example, I'll give you I was working with a company recently. We were talking about stress. We were talking about what are those little tidbit things that you do for just a couple of minutes to manage stress when you're feeling very overwhelmed, and broke people down into groups of 5 or 8 or something like that. And I watched around the room as everyone discussed the various things that they did. And these were learnings that are helpful for our daily lives at work, outside of work. So that's where I really flipped it. It became more about what people have to say to one another with my facilitation. I'm posing those questions to elicit the curiosity and to elicit the discussion. But people take it from there, because again, it's within each and every one of us.
Yeah. What's awesome about that is the fact that they see each other differently, right? When you're in a group and you go, I didn't know you did that too, or I didn't even know you were struggling with that, and all of a sudden you get these different connections.
Yes.
Instead of just, this is the work we do together. It's like, oh, I could go to Elyse and share this with her, or ask her for her tip on this, because we may be simpatico in how we think about things, or she could help. So I really love that, because it does strengthen relationships beyond the topic at hand.
Absolutely. And it makes those relationships better at work. And then when we're leaving work and we go back into our normal lives, or our lives outside of work, rather, that also can be reinforced there. It's stuff that we can use with whomever it is that's living in our home, with our friends, with our children, with whomever it is, with our parents. And that's what I really love about it, and those teachings that carry over into multiple environments.
So what is the difference? This may seem like an obvious question to you, but I know I've caught myself thinking one thing, but knowingly doing it the other way. What is the difference between being curious, and then just being curious because you're trying to make a point? So you're trying to pretend you're curious, but you're asking a question that actually is a leading question, or can only go in one direction. So when you're working with people, how do you differentiate that? Do you see that?
Absolutely, I do. And I think that it is a wonderful question with a really nuanced answer. Um, when you think back to listening and you think back to question asking, the intention that you have, I think, is really forms the foundation of the answer to what you're asking. The intention is to listen, to understand somebody else, not to, okay, let me get through steps A, B, C, and D. Let me ask these questions so then I can go in with my point. I think when you're listening with curiosity, you're really not coming in with what the end result is. It's about the journey. It's not about answering some question in a yes or no type of a way. This is the answer or this is not the answer. This is a journey and a process.
So I'm kind of reflecting on some of past experiences I've had with groups, right? So it is not uncommon for someone to want you to come in and facilitate to create some sort of outcome, right? But there's a preconceived idea that the outcome has to look a certain way. And yet if you go in with curiosity, oftentimes the outcome does not come out in the preconceived way. So do you start when you're in your co-creating part? I'm just thinking about, are you clear and transparent about that with someone saying, well, I understand this is your outcome, but if we're doing team relationships, it may not look that way. Or how do we do that? Because that's not uncommon.
Absolutely. And again, another wonderful, wonderful point. And what I go back to is similar to what I just said before. I said, this is a process and a journey. We could be aiming for this. And in our conversation, when we're figuring out what the needs are, we could spell out that this is what the end result is going to be. But you have multiple members of a team that are coming in with very, very different expectations for what that's going to look like. So we talk a little bit in the beginning is, yes, we are looking to have this end result or we're looking to address this, but there could be other outcomes that we don't expect. It's not a clear journey. This is a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Yeah. Don't you find like sometimes when you do that, you stand back at the end of it and you're just amazed by what's come out of it because you know it wasn't you. It was them. Mm-hmm. And their brilliance, right? When they actually get into having those conversations and learning.
Right.
So what's been one of the most fun ahas for you in doing something like that where you went, whoa, that was great?
Mm-hmm. I can think of a couple of examples. For me, when I'm running groups, and sometimes the groups that I do it inside onsite are based on some life commonality, parenting, sandwich generation, living on your own for the first time, whatever the topic may be. There's those groups, and then there are other groups that I do that are based upon things we all experience, stress, potentially burnout, those kinds of things. So for me, I think a couple of pieces that are so joyous for me in doing this kind of work. I can remember two examples in particular that I lean on quite a bit. I was doing a group within an organization and the group was meeting, I think for about 6 times. We had 6 1-hour sessions that we had scheduled. And there was somebody who always showed up on time. She was real quiet in the session, didn't say anything, but it was always polite, said a little bit. And I was like getting nervous. I'm like, wow, she's really not talking all that much. By the 4th session, she starts sharing things that were relevant for her colleagues to know about her life experience. And it was like, wow. And that to me was a real example of how this stuff really works. And I was reading the room a little bit and the colleagues were surprised at what she shared and were happy and warm and welcoming to her. But that to me was something that was so beautiful and heartfelt about the work. There was that connection, that sense of, I feel included here. I feel that sense of belonging. And then I had another example in a workshop. I was doing a parenting group. And we were talking about a topic, and there were 2 individuals in there from very different parts of the organization. And they were going into a moment in time where their teams would be overlapping, but they really hadn't. And we were talking about this topic, and one person said to the other, wow, I have a lot of information about that. We can continue this conversation online. And that to me was like, yes, we are building something strong here. We are building outside of this 1 hour that's happening every other week, once a month, whatever it is. And we're building something that is much, much bigger.
I think our work, not for everybody. I speak sometimes in blanket statements, but I know that's not the case. But so many of us relate to our work and our work families. And so when those things happen and you get those stronger connections, boy, it increases a feeling of safety in the workplace too. It's like I'm not just this cog in this wheel.
Yes.
I am part of a bigger whole. Yeah. So I really like how you approach that. And it underscores it being a process, right? 4 times in before she's in a place to share. And we don't all show up at the same place at the same time.
Absolutely. And that's been part of it. And in doing this kind of group work, some groups are slower to start than others. And we have to be mindful that it is a process. It is a journey. And every group that we do looks a little bit differently.
What are the, for the groups that kind of gel quickly, let's say, and those that take a little longer, what are some of the characteristics or underlying similarities in those groups? Are there any that you can point to?
That's a great question. And I think that the answer to that is it depends. Sometimes you have in the group, and this is just what happens in groups of all kinds, you have somebody who takes that initiation and takes on that more of a leadership role, even though within the organization, they may not be the leader. They may be the person who's posing a lot of those curious questions, as we were talking about earlier. So that becomes modeled within the group, and they are able to give a little bit of that food for thought, and then that becomes what defines what the group is. And you have people, again, for all of the groups that I do, it is voluntary participation because people want to be there, and this is not going to be for everybody. So I think that you have somebody that does that, then you have that person who's the good listener. And I think people go into where their places that are comfortable, but then as the group starts to gel and you have those different diverse backgrounds and diverse experiences and diverse personalities, then people start to take on and they start to take more risks by perhaps being more of the question asker. Because to your point, it's a safe space to take those risks and do something a little bit different.
And we can, I always have this, someone goes, this is a safe space. And I'm thinking, I don't know you. This is the first time I've ever met you. Why would I believe you? You know, right. And that's just me. I'm just like, I come at things like I'm always thinking, okay, I'm going to make sure I'm okay. You know, right. Don't know the rest of the room. I'm going to make sure I'm not doing anything to damage anybody in the room. But you got to put up before I trust you, right? Because people can say what they want. Mm-hmm. You have to show up as you say you are. So that's why I really like this, having time for people to go, okay, I feel safe. And it can be personality driven, but it could also be from previous experiences where maybe they were told that and then they got hammered for not, you know, it's like, well, we'd like your opinion. Oh, that won't work. Right. Mm-hmm. Nothing makes you feel better than when someone says, hey, Elyse, what do you think about this? And you risk sharing and someone goes, oh, yeah, we've done that before. Thanks. No. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, not the best. But you talked about curious questions. So give some examples or comparisons of what is a true curious question versus a question that might masquerade as such.
Right. I think that a lot of it is in, I always say, I like to ask questions that are what and how, and they are specific to that individual person. Psychologist way back, I remember being in a webinar, and one of the things he talked about is, well, how did you do that? And I love the framing of that question. That is a curious question that gets into the heart of how you, Sarah, did something, which may look differently than how Elyse, I did it. That to me is a curious question. You're asking about somebody's individual experience. It talks to curiosity. So a lot of those what questions and how questions. What I do like to, and again, some of this also comes down to tone. What I have been trying to do professionally and personally is to steer away a little bit from some of the why questions. The why questions at some points can feel very accusatory, and they may not be what we're absolutely intending to do, but they can come across in a way that may not feel as good. And I can say this in, again, any kind of relationships, even talking to your kids, it can really be something that you may not get the responses that you were intending to do because of the execution on the questions. So I keep going back to this idea. It's to understand, not to say, oh, well, you just said that, so now I can definitely say what this response is. They come with a real goal on your part to understand.
Yeah, why questions tend to put people on their heels. It's like, okay, now I've got to defend.
Yeah.
Unless you're asking it broad, like, why do the leaves change like that? That's not about, it's like, because you can learn about it, right? That is a curious question. But so why are you here? You could ask that differently, right? How did you get here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I love your distinction between that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I know a lot of times there's a lot of push when we look on social media and we look on other, finding your why. That to me is a little bit of a different, that to me, it does not feel as accusatory. Yeah. But I think that there's some of the times, that's why I say it really depends. It depends on the tone. And sometimes I like to ask things, well, what do you think the intention was? Or what were the factors that led to that? And coming at it with a bit of curiosity and being really accepting of what the response is and then asking deeper, more follow-up questions.
Well, I like that you mentioned intention, because you can have, or I could have best of intentions in asking a question and it could still land wrong. Mm-hmm. And so I try to remind myself and others when they get upset, it's like, well, what do you think the intention of that question was? Well, they blah, blah, blah. And I says, oh, do you know that for a fact? No. And I says, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Right. And maybe they're just jerks, but let's give them the benefit of the doubt, right? But because otherwise we don't get any kind of control about how we feel about something.
Yes. Yes. So and I also talk too a lot about with that intention. There's a difference between intention as we're talking about an execution. And I always really try hard is to always to own my own behavior. If I've done something and my intention may have been a great one, but my execution was not as great, I'm going to own it.
Kind of happy.
And I'm not going to shy away from it. And I'm going to apologize with an intention for a greater understanding of what maybe I've done to offend somebody else, or to do it in a way that is going to be helpful to the other person and to show a bit more. We haven't talked about vulnerability yet.
Let's go there. I had a psychologist tell me once, I said, well, I know they didn't intend to do that. He says, well, let's picture this event. You and I are bowling together and I drop my bowling ball on your foot. I didn't mean to do it. And I said, no. And he says, okay, so I apologize. And then, I dropped it again. He goes, what's the effect? I said, I probably have a broken foot by now. And he goes, exactly. The intent wasn't there, but the effect was there.
Yes.
So to your point of having to take responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. But let's talk about vulnerability. And because I think sometimes people think it means just like saying everything, I'm vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that can have bad consequences if it's not in the right context. So how do we be vulnerable and real and safe?
Okay, I think there's a couple of things that I'm thinking about, as you said, the vulnerability, the safety, and going back to this whole notion of curiosity. When we come at a situation and we're asking questions, those questions are actually a show of vulnerability. It may not necessarily feel that way, and for some it may feel safe because somebody's bringing up something we may not know something about. I know for me, again, talking about not having a deep business background, when I started this work, I spent half my time looking up what acronyms were within the business world. I didn't know what any of them were. So I'm frantically Googling while I'm on Zooms and while I'm in other things. And I got to a place where I felt more comfortable asking questions about that. I'm not familiar with that. What exactly does that mean? How does that look for you? That is a show of vulnerability without having to truly disclose ourselves. So sometimes I think that these words get this really, I don't know if they get a bad rap as much as we don't necessarily understand them so deeply. But vulnerability comes from that inquisitive, curious nature. You're showing your vulnerability. And it's a great way within a work environment to showcase that empathy piece as well by being vulnerable and demonstrating, especially for leaders, is to demonstrating that to others within your organization.
I think that can also let other people shine. When if you're my boss and you say, Sarah, I'm not sure how this works, right? It's like, I can help you, if I know that, right?
Yes.
So I think it leaves room for other people to show up as in a different role or a bigger way than they might otherwise.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you mentioned something before in your writing about friendships. Let's talk about friendships. I understand. I love the word. I don't know if you made it up or not, but I just think that is the best concept. So talk about what friendship relationships are and how you benefited from them.
Okay. So I really have to give credit to Danielle Farage. She is the originator of that term, and she has talked about it through the various work that she is doing, a lot of the Gen Z space and the intergenerational space. So I have really, we have a friendship, she and I, and then I have a number of people within my world that are business colleagues and they are friends, and we have this real unique relationship. And again, I cannot give Danielle enough credit on this yet, for Danielle Farage, that we come from different backgrounds, different ages, different whatever it is, and we have this relationship where we are really focused on being friends and supporting one another as we are building either businesses or some other work-related goals. So I think that to me is really what the basis of that friendship is. And these are really people that, relationships come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. And when I think about the friendships, it's that balance of business, and then it's the balance of the personal piece as well, where just for parents, sometimes, I always joke, you're in a relationship sometimes with people, the relationship is defined by getting your kids from point A to point B. Yeah. That's a different kind of relationship. The friendship relationship, I think, is really about the business and the personal people that I have really grown to feel so deeply about and to really value their experience, their ability to give really good feedback, sometimes when we don't want to hear the feedback, and to just be there as a wonderfully supportive friend.
So how is that distinct from mentorship?
Because with mentorship, a lot of the time, and I have a few examples here, we look at mentorship as somebody who's older and they're mentoring somebody who's younger. And thanks to getting to know Danielle and working with her over the years, I've really looked at mentorship very differently. I know from Inside Onsite, I've had a number of different younger people working with me. And I think some of the stereotype is, younger people, they're really good at tech. And older people may not be as good as tech. And that's where they can learn from one another. But I think that that's really limiting in terms of our thoughts, in that when you have conversations, it's really about taking ideas and talking about complex ideas and learning from one another. It really has been for me a battle to get people to understand, like, we are learning from one another. This is not a one-way street. I don't have the answers. I'm curious, what do you think about that? How would you frame that? How would you do this? What's your spin on that? Those are the areas, again, going back to the curiosity piece, that makes the friendship very, very different from a traditional mentorship that we would take. And again, when we're dealing intergenerationally, it is not just about tech.
Yeah. And I love how you said that. What's your spin on that? What do you take away from that? Because it's surprising the answers you get.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are just like, wow, that is so great. I never thought about that. Thanks.
Yes.
And by the way, I'm taking it.
Right. And I talk all the time about how when we're in these friendship relationships, or we're just engaging with people, a lot of it is about we. This is, so much of the work at Inside Onsite is, I want to take the I out of this. This is about we. How can we problem solve these pieces together? And that goes back to the friendship and the mentorship as well. How is it? Oh, wow, we talk this through. This is not about you. This is not about me. This is about we. And right, I've never thought about it that way. Let's talk about that a little bit more. How can we move this forward?
Yeah. I don't do very good moving stuff forward on my own. Like, all I need is 20 minutes from a friend. Now I know they're my friendships.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like, okay, can I run this by you? What thoughts do you have?
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, I could have spent 2 hours and not gotten there. So
yeah.
But to your point, you have to be willing to say you don't know.
Exactly. And I will say, years ago, I wasn't in that place to say that I don't know. And I can think about a client I worked with recently. I was struggling with one part of this presentation, and I'm like, okay, this is where it is now. I want to see how this executes. And years ago, this would have sent me right over the edge. I was due to give a talk with them about a half an hour before. They're like, you know what? Can we rethink this a little bit? And we did, and we finished. I was set to speak, 50 or 60 people. 3 minutes before we had finished doing the changes. And I felt, because we had that dynamic together with the client and myself, I felt that much better going into that engagement. And I have to tell you, with their help, I think that the talk went incredibly, incredibly well. And I could not have done that.
Well, you had a champion. It's their presentation now, right? So they're going to cheer you on. I think we forget that. It isn't about the person who's in the front of the room. It's like the people who are standing with you there, whether they're literally there or figuratively there.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's what I tell myself.
It's the we.
It's the we.
The we. Mm-hmm.
I love that so much. It's great getting older. That's all I can say. So there's a couple of things you say. There are quotes that you have, that people who have connections at work will stay at work.
Mm-hmm.
You just talked about more we, less I, and more asking and less assuming. Mm-hmm. So those are 3 quotes that you like. Yes. So when you use those, how do you integrate that? Sarah, how do you integrate that into the philosophy, into your programs per se?
Right. So what I think when we talk about relationships at work, and we can go into really where I started from is the loneliness data. Dr. Vivek Murthy has talked about the loneliness epidemic in this country. Okay. So what I think happens from there, unfortunately, is that there seems to be a pendulum swing where now there's terms like office bestie, and that you need to have your best friends. That is one end of a continuum on friendship. As I talked about earlier, relationships come in all different shapes and sizes. And there are people that may be your best friends, but there are a lot of relationships in between. And when I say that people have connections at work, they will stay at work, really what that's grounded in is data that's suggesting that if we feel connected to our colleagues, we are more likely to stay. If we don't have a sense of belonging, if we don't feel that we are included, we're going to start looking for other places where we feel that there is a place for us. So when I talk about that, it's really coming from the data. And again, this is not about office besties. Inside Onsite builds connection, relationships, and I talk about it in two ways as well, a mutual respect for one another based upon deeper understanding. So reframing it in that way really goes back to the connections at work. I think the second one we talked about was more we, less I. That's another one that I say again that I think we have reiterated throughout our time together. And that's where we see the real progress being made a lot of the time. And again, in my work at Inside Onsite, I like to push in. And when I say in, that does not mean necessarily in person. Sometimes the work is virtual. I will meet you inside, and the work at Inside Onsite, we meet organizations where they are, so we can be together. And the work happens, I would say, at work, again, could be virtual or in person, during the workday. So this is not something that you need to handle on your own. We do this work together, and not with an expectation that you have to go do something outside on your own personal time.
Yeah, just add one more thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Woohoo! That's motivational right there.
Exactly.
What do you think the future of mental health in the workspace is?
That is a great question. From what I see, there is this differentiation between mental well-being and mental health. So what I see more as the future of work within this space is about mental well-being, about people who are feeling good about the work, they're feeling good about their colleagues, they're feeling good about their, as we were talking about earlier, kind of their sense of having some type of a balance. It's not work-life balance because we have phones and we are completely reachable at all times by everyone in our universe. So it's not about balance, but it's really more about how is it that we feel integrated? How is it that we can set boundaries? That to me is really about the well-being and about our lives. So the mental health piece of it, I mean, that's some, as a psychologist, I think that that's some of the pieces that maybe are not necessarily where the focal piece is at work, because these are not mental health clinics within work environments. What
Right.
we're looking to do is to foster people that feel good at work. I know there's a lot of talk about happiness, right? So those pieces into that as well, but this mental well-being, that we can feel good about what it is that we're doing.
And I might, if it's okay with you, extend that to say, regardless of my mental health status, that would apply to me. Because I could be struggling with a mental health challenge that might be lifelong or just just for the time being, but I still can have well-being at work.
Yes. And that's where sometimes I think the differentiation can be, but all of the things that we do for mental well-being will contribute to our mental health as well. They're not so separate necessarily. And again, it's more integrated. But these are the kinds of things that I talked about, having the connections, about feeling that we belong, about having a space for us, about recognizing our both, about being recognized, about having boundaries. These are all parts of mental health as well, but they're really, the cornerstone is within mental well-being.
Yeah, so much of what you talked about fits into like the social determinants of overall health as well. And, it's all integrated.
It's all integrated.
We all want to piece out what's the silver bullet. And I'm saying, well, it's the whole package.
Mm-hmm.
You can work on parts, but ultimately it's the whole package.
Right.
So,
right. And if you look at that longitudinal work out of Harvard on adult development, they talk a lot about it being about our adult relationships, about this is the foundation. So there's social determinants of behavior and what it is that helps us to thrive throughout life, throughout the lifespan, is really about our relationships.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. Because once those go in communities as well, you can go into communities that are suffering and you're going, well, there are miles between people. So people don't even know they're suffering, right?
Exactly.
Like, there's no connection. So, and then you take out technology. Oh, then there's less connection.
Right.
So, I mean, it's just so interesting. We were meant to be together.
We are meant to be together. And, I don't want to discount too with technology. Sometimes I say that we ask these questions a lot of the time, and thinking about technology that swim in a sea of gray. They swim somewhere in the middle. And I think technology is one of them. For some people, that technology can be a lifeline to some of those socialization pieces. Again, there's positives and negatives to.
No, but if we don't have the technology infrastructure, so you don't have a internet and you can't get into those other spaces, then that's what I meant by tech.
Yeah.
The access.
Right.
I guess it's more of an access connection.
Right. Like
thank you for catching me on that. But I want to switch gears. Before I take you off of your topic, I have a different topic about something you're reading or finished reading recently.
Great.
But is there anything else you want to say on this at the moment?
No, I think we've covered a lot of really interesting topics, and it's always nice to have thought-provoking conversation that feeds the soul. And I thank you for engaging in this. And this is the kind of stuff we need. We need more of. We need more of this to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm glad you're out there doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Super. Okay, I want to talk about you're reading a book. Rabbi Daniel Browd. Is that how you say it? Browd?
Yes, I believe so. Mm-hmm.
Okay. About growing positive speech, and it's Learn Hilchos Lashon Hara. I looked at that. I'm going, I'm not sure I know how to pronounce that.
Lashon Hara. So basically what this is, and a friend of mine had suggested it, and there's a lot of talk about how we speak about other people, some of the pieces around gossip, but not even gossip necessarily. It's more speaking about others. And it's really daily life lessons about how to be really considerate of yourself and be considerate of other people when you're choosing to have conversations about some third person, even if you're giving them the greatest praise. And it's really enabled me to think a little bit differently, even if I'm saying something so wonderful about somebody else, like to take a pause and to say, is that really what I want to do? Again, I'm really not doing it a lot of justice. But what I really do like about it is that they're daily lessons that enable you to think a little bit about how we talk about other people in a much larger world.
So it's not solely about the words we choose, but it's about why we're even speaking.
Yeah, it's about what is it that we're saying and what is the impact of what it is that we're saying in the greater scheme of things. And it's just enabled me to be a bit more mindful about some of the things that I say. And I've enjoyed it as a real, just a real thought exercise, and to just think a little bit differently. And it's like, oh, well, maybe I don't agree with that, or maybe I agree with that. And then I'll read a couple of lessons later, like, oh, that's how that circled back to this. Oh, now this makes sense. So it's just about, how we use our tongue, so to speak. So I've been really enjoying that experience.
I was glad to see that you put that in there, because I'm always curious. I'm curious about a couple of things about how the choice of words, so like neurolinguistics always has interested me. But then I started listening when I'm in groups, because that's my comfort zone. I'll just listen. But I've sat there, I'm thinking, why are they saying that? What was the point of that, right? Speaking about a third person, right? It wasn't negative, but I start wondering, do we say those things to make ourselves feel better, to be admired by other people? Do we need to share those things, right? Was it my story to share in the first place? So I just wonder about that. And then I think, Sarah, get back on track, girl.
Right.
But it's a curiosity, like, are there other things I might be able to contribute that aren't about somebody else?
Yeah. Or a lot of times too, I guess, from being in private practice for such a long time and taking this more, I think more into my personal life, is that I would say, tell me a story. Don't use any names. I just want to hear the facts of the story. Because sometimes when we put those names in, we can come in with some preconceived notions about things. Just tell me what the facts are has been a way in which I think through things a little bit. But still, I would say this all the time. I don't have an interest in talking about other people when they're not there.
There's enough going on without having to worry about that. Something, interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks. And it can sound, and my husband goes, well, are you worried about that? He says, no, they didn't invite me into this. Like, they didn't invite me to weigh in, right? So I hope they're good. I'm glad they're making a moving forward decision. Thanks for the input. That's it. I have no opinion. But I want to get this book because it sounds extremely helpful.
Yes, it really is. It's thought provoking. It's I've been enjoying it, and it's something you could read a couple of minutes each day.
Okay, nice. I'll put a link to it in the show notes if you're listening and you want to know that. We'll put a link to it in there. Well, I know you offer a gift for listeners if they're listening to you today. Will you share what that is?
Sure. What I'm offering is a free 15-minute consultation on my website. You can go there and you can access my calendar and we can chat a little bit. And it's www.insightonsite.org, INSIGHTONSITE.org. And you can schedule that time in my calendar. And I would be very happy from this podcast to chat with you a little bit more.
So you guys, if you're listening or when you're listening to this, it could be a very helpful chat. So, and come on, Elyse is totally approachable. So Elyse, I'm going to leave you with the final words for the podcast episode. So what is something you want us to think about as we're signing off today?
Okay. Sarah, I'm going to circle back to a conversation that we had offline just as we got started. And I want to come back to this idea of curiosity. And one of the ways in which I've been thinking about framing it as of late is to think about how can we engage in conversations with somebody who maybe has a different point of view than you do or has a different belief system. How can we engage in those situations with a mutual curiosity? You coming in not knowing like that person's wrong about that because they said A, B, and C. Really engaging in those conversations where you are curious about what them and their experience and maybe the root of some of what their beliefs are. And then for the other person coming back at you with that and having some more conversations when we're really seeking to understand rather than to be understood. I think that's right out of Stephen Covey. So that's really one of my parting thoughts. And if we can practice a little more about that, I'd be so curious to hear how people do with that and what some of their strategies were so that we can start building this as part of our communities and in society.
So listeners, wherever you're listening, if you want to rate and review this interview with Elyse, we would love that. And we would love your thoughts on how you are engaging in those curious, truly curious conversations. And if you've got some super duper questions that you like to ask, that the rest of us can learn from. So With that, I'm inviting you to rate and review. Share this episode because I think Elyse is a great guest. And I know that I've benefited just from getting to speak with her today. And we'll be back next week.
You've been listening to the No Labels, No Limits podcast with best-selling author, change agent, and strategic business coach, Sarah Box. You can grab the show notes and find out how to work with Sarah at sarahbox.com/No Labels, No Limits podcast. We'd love this podcast to reach as many people as possible. Please remember to rate, leave a 5-star review, and share the podcast with someone you think would get value from this conversation. Till next time, keep taking those daily action steps to align your purpose to your principles and achieve your goals in business and life.